Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming along to this Inside Ofcom and for braving the lack of curly sandwiches. Today is the first in a three-part series looking at hyperlocal that I've organised. It's a topic that I think is increasingly becoming a bit of a hot potato in some circles, and the intention of today's session is to just give you a bit of a flavour for what hyperlocal is and to talk through some examples of different hyperlocal products and services that are available in the UK. When I was first doing the slides for this, I ended up with 140 of them, which to say the least was clearly a bit much. But so what you're going to get today is kind of the 7-inch cut-down version, and the 12-inch extended version will be available on the loop with all of the links and references at a later point. So this is the plan for today. Just going to quickly rattle through why I think this matters to us, try and define what we mean by hyperlocal, look at some examples. I'm going to focus on web and print and community print. I'm not really going to talk about local TV. But that could be an entire topic on its own accord, as indeed could community radio. But there is stuff on both of those in the extended pack. And then I'm also going to look at trends, barriers, and opportunities for this sector. So in terms of why this matters, well, we probably all know that the current government has a huge kind of local and localism agenda. Further announcements last night around public services. Jeremy Hunt has referenced in his work around local TV and ambitions for his department, hyperlocal, the BS word, big society. It has also referenced hyperlocal quite frequently. And in terms of other stuff that's going on, and we probably all know about Martha Lane Fox's work at Race Online 2012 and the ambition to get everybody of working age online during this parliament. I was also going to put a picture of Eric Pickles on here, but there wasn't room. Now, I first got interested in this sector last year when we did a very extensive report on regional and local media. And one of the pieces of research we did was asking focus groups what media they consumed and what trends had emerged over the last couple of years. And I think what was really interesting, at the time we started doing that report, there was lots of stuff in the papers about the death of local news, the death of journalism, and so forth. Yet what our research showed was that actually people were consuming more news, not less. And in particular, websites were being consumed much more voraciously. And I think it was particularly interesting for us, who hadn't really known much about community websites, that actually you had 34% of people saying they consumed this more by the time we did this research summer last year than they were doing 2 years ago. And that's partly as a result of there being a lot more hyperlocal and community websites available, but also because when people find these sites, they tend to come back to them and use them quite a lot. So our research showed us all these kind of things really, and most of which I think are fairly self-explanatory, that localness matters to consumers, that people are tending to consume more stuff online than they were before, and there's new business models emerging all the time. And then I thought it was also useful to try and reference this in terms of our work, such as it still stands in the PSB sphere, just in terms of understanding how local media is changing, the role that hyperlocal can play in that wider ecology. So in terms of, is it frozen? There we go, hyperlocal itself, well, there's no specific definition for it, but broadly speaking, this is kind of what we're talking about. So it's about news and content that relates to a town or a village, or it might even just be your street, but it's very specific. It focuses on a particular geographical area, and it's traditionally much smaller than areas served by big media, so TV, radio, or even newspapers. There are many different models. There are some professional models, not many people making money in this space, but a few. An awful lot is produced by citizens in their spare time. So some of the people I've met at some conferences that we've been involved in will spend 3 or 4 hours a day of their time maintaining and producing material for these websites. And they usually have day jobs too, but they're extremely passionate and committed about their community, and one of the ways in which they demonstrate that is through stuff they produce online. We get a mixture of hybrid sites, particularly from newspaper groups, where you have journalists working with volunteers or citizen journalists producing content for sites, and then some kind of aggregated and automated sites. There's one, for example, in London called Planet Balham, which was set up, which just uses RSS feeds for anything that mentions the word Balham, and it just pulls in all of that content. So the guy who runs that site had to do very little other than set up a few Google alerts and so forth, and it just populates itself. But it's still a very useful source, and it pulls together everything from council or blogs, Flickr, and so forth. In terms of characteristics for the sector, and I've already kind of mentioned about the localized element of it, I think the second part is really important, actually, that many of the people who produce this stuff feel there is a real gap in either their area just not being covered by traditional media, or that there are particular issues or topics that they feel are just not being addressed by the mainstream media. Not a lot of funding involved, but what there is, as we see with community radio, is very diverse. Some from public sector, but it comes from a variety of different sources. Some of the hyperlocal sites you'll see will have little donation boxes. Some of them will carry advertising, like Google Ads, or through a new product called Adipply. But it often produces very small amounts of revenue. But very few people are doing this to make money or to make their millions. For them, the value is often around what is being produced and the process by which it's produced, as much as the actual content itself. So I'm going to talk about some specific examples. This is perhaps the most high-profile video example that we've seen in recent months. I don't know if any of you saw, there was an article in The Guardian which revealed that Stig had been sacked from Top Gear as a result of his book deal. And this was picked up by a site called Whitney TV. Now, it's not a TV station in the traditional sense. It's basically a website which has a few videos on it. They have a weekly video. And Jeremy Clarkson had been at an event in Whitney, and they'd basically doorstepped him that evening. I think he had comped or been the kind of chief auctioneer at the charity event. And he spoke on camera and told them that Stig had been sacked. And then this got picked up by the mainstream media and has been referenced in various kind of government discussions since. Now, what's quite interesting for me is, first of all, how it all started about. So it was 4 volunteers who set up this site. They used 11 grand of their own money and just created it and just put it up online. It's completely unregulated, so they can just go ahead and do it. In terms of its audience, we had 10,000 views in the first week, but when this Stig story went kind of global, they had 3.5 million people looking at their website, and yet this is in a town with a population of 25,000 people, which is just extraordinary. And what is equally extraordinary is that Whitney TV is not the only online local video station for this tiny small town. You've also got the fantastic name Twitney TV, which is also providing a similar sort of service for the same area. Mon TV in Wales has been running for a couple of years. Fantastic website, run by 2 professional filmmakers who do this in their spare time and when they're between jobs. They have 1 paid member of staff who delivers training to students, and that's how they fund that. And the students produce content that goes up on their website. And they do a weekly 15-minute bulletin, which is just someone sat in a room like this in front talking to camera about stuff that's been going on in their area. But again, it's also been tremendously popular. Within 2 years, it has had 1 million visitors to its site, and yet that bit of Monmouthshire not terribly well populated, if anybody knows it. In terms of print, this is probably the stuff you're most familiar with. There's things like newsletters from resident associations and so forth, but also what we're starting to see is more and more kind of hyperlocal newspapers that are being produced by the community, often being supported by a web presence. So this is from the Blackbird Leys estate in Oxfordshire, which I don't know if any of you know. It's not far outside of the City of Dreaming Spires, but it is quite a deprived area, often used by news crews when they want to get a perspective that doesn't involve being in W1 or W12. And as you can see, it's put through every door on that estate, reaching 14,000 people. And it's supported by a website which has very kind of basic stuff on it for residents in terms of calendar events, useful contact numbers, and so forth. But given the high level of deprivation in that area, they've made the assumption, probably rightly so, that many of the people there are not going to be online. So they print off copies of their listing magazine and post it around in useful locations where people, if they need to access that information, can do so. Another one that's been running for quite a long time, even longer still, over 30 years, in Coventry. I don't know these bits of Coventry, I don't know if anybody else does, but 4 small districts of Coventry, you get the Echo newspaper, which fantastically is only 30p, which might make it one of the most cheap paid for newspapers in the UK. It's produced entirely by volunteers, and what I also like about it is that the way that they've the way it's distributed is that they've pulled in local partners from churches to pubs, community centres and so forth, who will all distribute this newspaper. And that includes newsagents. And typically when newsagents sell a paper, they get a commission on it. In this case, they don't. Hackney Citizen. Now, here's one I prepared earlier. Does anybody else apart from Katie live in Hackney or know the Hackney Citizen? It is a Green Party front, but we'll come on to that. So there's some examples of the Hackney Citizen here. Now, this is...
I wouldn't like the cat's litter tray with it.
But you can pass it on, Katie. There we go. So this is a publication which has been going for, I think, about 2 years now, run by a guy called Keith Magnum, who used to work for the Green Party. And it's distributed by hand all around Hackney. Literally, they get it printed and they go around with big carrier bags and stand at stations and other kind of places and hand it out. And I can't comment on the editorial, Katie already has, but I think the quality of it is surprisingly good, really. I mean, both in terms of the articles and the way it's produced and so forth. Particularly when you consider that the person who's running it has no journalistic experience whatsoever, but is extremely passionate about his area, and so he just decided to go ahead and do this. He doesn't earn a salary from it. He basically sponges off his girlfriend and assorted friends, but is clearly extremely committed to what they're doing. There's also, it does carry adverts, but it's quite an interesting slant on advertising. They won't take adverts from big companies or those that might rival local businesses. So, for example, they were approached by Morrison's about advertising, and they said no, even though it probably would have kept Keith in pasta for a few more weeks. And then one of the things they do to get content, I talked earlier very briefly when I mentioned about the Planet Balham example, the way in which these sites are often using content produced by others that they're bringing in and then squirting out. And this is an example of how the Hackney Citizen is using the Guardian's API to take stories that relate to Hackney. So on the make sure I get this right, on the left is the original. This is how it appeared in The Guardian. And then this is how it appeared the next day in the Hackney Citizen. Now, if you can see it on the screens, what you'll see, I mean, the text is exactly the same. There's a slightly different picture, but there's the same same title and everything else, and the text is exactly the same. But it immediately gives them a great source of content, and even though The Guardian are providing this service for free, I think by the association with a national brand of the quality of The Guardian is probably good for that site. In terms of commercial operations, well, there's only really two. There we go. One is in our neighbourhood. Do you all know the SE1 website and all use the SE1 website? So this has been running for over the last 10 years. If you put SE1 into Google, this is what comes up. Run by a guy called James Hatz and his father. I mentioned at the beginning this is a part of a series, and the next session we're going to do is going to look at community media in SE1, and James, who runs this, will be one of the people who will come in and talk about their business and what they do. It's commercial in as much as they take advertising. It's predominantly funded as an affiliate model. So if you book a restaurant in SE1 through them, or you are a holidaymaker staying in a hotel here, and you book it via a link via them, they will get a percentage of that, and that's the major way in which they fund themselves. And I think their turnover is about 28,000 a year. So it's not huge, but it's enough to kind of live off. And then it's supported by things like the weekly newsletter and the printed What's On guide, which you've probably seen floating around the hub and elsewhere. The only other people I know who are making money of sorts from this are the guys who run NeighbourNet in West London. They started this in 2000 at a time when everybody thought that there was a kind of new media gold rush and that you would make your millions extremely quickly, and here they are 10 years on, still sort of struggling along to survive. They run a number of different sites in West London, and the way in which they monetize it is very traditional, really. They go out and sell adverts like a local newspaper would, and they make you sign up to receive their newsletters and other bits and pieces, and that way they can get the demographic information they need to go out and sell the adverts. Beyond that, in terms of ascertaining what their turnover and stuff is, it's very hard to say, and the guy who runs it is extremely vague. Forums are probably the stuff you're most familiar with. Some of these are extremely popular. I live in East Dulwich. I don't know if anybody else uses the East Dulwich Forum or knows that. I mean, that's a fantastic resource. Sheffield Forum is probably the biggest. I mean, it's just phenomenal, really. You've got 4.5 million posts at the end of last week, and you can tell because it says here the number of posts per topic. And for Sheffield discussions, 931,000 posts. Add them all up, you can see 4.5 million posts. And then they've got 111,000 registered users, which suggests a very high percentage of people in Sheffield who are online are probably using this site. Others, there's a site that's based in Brixton called Urban75. It's slightly Del Boy-esque, I think, by saying Brixton, London, New York, Cymru. But it's been running for an extremely long time, has lots of local content on it, but also a lot of kind of lifestyle stuff on it as well. And they're getting 250,000 page impressions every day. It doesn't carry any advertising at all. And then lastly, Haringey Online in N4 is an example of something that's a bit smaller, that's targeting the particular ward within Haringey. And they're using Ning and Flickr and those kind of what they call white label social media tools just to run their site. But they've already got 2,000 members and fantastically is already being pastiched by various members of their community, which I think is actually quite a compliment. Now, the campaigning side of this is the one I think that gets politicians in particular most interested. So this was the launch of the Big Society event, and the guy in the corner who you can kind of just about see is a guy called William Perrin, who used to be the communications advisor for Tony Blair, wrote a big part of the Comms Act, including, as he will often tell me, creating Ofcom, not Toby Young, as the fantastic comment on The Guardian suggested. And the reason William was there was because of the work that he's done around his website, King's Cross Environment, and then moved on to do other stuff across the UK championing this work. And William got into this space really because of problems that were in his neighbourhood. So this is his street. This is 400 metres away from King's Cross railway station. And about 2002, he said every week there were abandoned cars everywhere, or people were kind of blowing them up. This shot of a taxi here, if you look more closely, you see actually it's full of rubbish. And that was a regular kind of sight for him outside of his living room window. Equally, whenever there was a match game at Highbury, would that be the old Arsenal ground then? I guess it probably would have been. You'd have youths coming along stealing mopeds and doing street races. If you called 999 to get the police to come along, they wouldn't respond. They wouldn't come. So, and then lastly, this was the cracker van. So a local drug dealer lived in there. This is the view straight out of William's room. He didn't store his drugs in the van. He was too smart for that. He kept them in the park opposite. And some of you may remember there was a Have I Got News for You a few years ago with a story about squirrels that were high on drugs. Well, I think it was related to this because they're being hidden in trees and so forth, and often drugs being consumed by wild animals. So all in all, not a great place to live. And I think William's view was like, well, I can either move to the suburbs or I can try and do something about it. So he started by going down the traditional route. And this was the kind of routes that you'd end up going through: death by committee and various other traditional ways of trying to do something about your environment. And actually, after a while, he got immensely frustrated by this and thought there must be a better way and a quicker way of doing it. So he set up King's Cross Environment and used this website and new media tools to try and raise the issues that were being taking place on their doorstep. So one great example was opposite, pretty near to him, you had a massive plant run by Cemex who were producing concrete. It was extremely noisy, and they would make noise and run all hours of the day and night. He'd written and complained, and nothing had happened. So he said, "Okay, what can I do about it?" And he used his camera phone, and he recorded at various different times of day the amount of noise that was being produced, posted it on YouTube, and sent the links around. And suddenly, that started to elicit a much better response than a traditional letter-writing campaign. And he's got various other examples of similar things where he's done that, and where, by virtue of posting something on the website, he often gets a much quicker response than by going through traditional channels. And here you are, a few years down the line, there's 900 articles that are on that website. And that's all about a very specific part of King's Cross, and then again has a very specific angle, which is around trying to improve the quality of that environment. In a very different vein, there's a couple of nice storytelling examples which I think are worth kind of flagging up Spitalfields Life, which is very quaint and very charming, and every day there's a different story about somebody who lives and works around Spitalfield, which I would really recommend. I think it's fantastic, and you see readership from all around the world. The guy has this ambition to write 10,000 posts and tell 10,000 stories, which will take him quite some time. And then also going back to Hackney, slightly different bent, podcasts related to hyperlocal areas, and the Hackney podcast is an extremely good example of this. Has won a number of different awards and looks at specific topics or features related to that geographic area. So, in terms of trends, I'm going to quickly rattle through the kind of top 5 things that I think are emerging. There's a lot of talk from government about open data and transparency, and a lot of excitement from certain parts of this community about data journalism and interrogating data to try and find out what's really going on. So as an example of that, Adrian Short has created this website for his borough where he is going through and looking at every different line of expenditure by his council and trying to ascertain where there is waste or not. We're seeing quite a lot of civic engagement on these sites. So Formby First was set up by rather lovely Sean Brady, who's a parish councillor, and he wanted to find a different way to explain what parish councils do. So he set up a website to do it. Similarly, I mentioned East Dulwich Forum earlier, which is a site that I use a lot. James Barber, who is a councillor in East Dulwich, uses that site a lot to respond to different things. When the swimming pool reopened after having been closed for a year and there were various problems with heating and so forth, the way in which this was communicated from the council was primarily through James's posts on the website. Third trend we're starting to see is hyperlocal advertising. Both in terms of the stuff on some of the websites we've already seen, but also through smartphones and location-based advertising. So if you've got your phone on and it's telling you where your geographic location is, it's creating opportunities for advertisers to push specific messages to you. And this stuff is already live in the UK. Started about 2 weeks ago with O2. I don't know if anyone's an O2 More customer, but you will then get messages if you're in a particular area where there is a service that an advertiser wants you to access. You will get an SMS to your phone about it. We're also seeing the kind of big traditional media companies going hyperlocal. We won't talk about ITV Local, but this is STV Local, which launched quite recently. They've got an ambition to produce something like 150 to 200 hyperlocal sites within Scotland, and they think it's a big part of their business model and how they're going to continue to survive. Pages look a bit like that, and as you see, they're targeting very specific areas, certainly much smaller than where their broadcasting footprint is. Newspapers have been doing this for a while. Associated Digital launched an initiative, 23 areas just last year, but they want to have 200 areas by the end of the year. Guardian are doing some hyperlocal stuff in a couple of cities, and Trinity Mirror is doing this kind of hybrid of having professional journalists working with volunteers to produce material in areas like Uxbridge and around there. And of course, you've also got traditional newspaper sites also offering more cut-down versions. So ignore the scantily clad woman in the corner. The point I'm actually wanting to show you is if you look at the Croydon Today website, then you can go on and access news for all of the kind of sub-areas within Croydon. And then the last trend is around journalism and how news is being created. Andrew Marr created quite a bit of a fuss for some people the other week when he was extremely critical of citizen journalism and bloggers. Now, this is probably a whole separate debate in itself. Some people feel this is not journalism, they're not journalists, and that's actually a key reason for why they're successful in what they do. John Bounds, who runs the fantastic name Birmingham It's Not Shit website, is one such person who says, I write about what I want, I'm not bound to advertisers, I'm not funded by the council or anybody else, I can be extremely critical and comment on whatever I want to. But there are plenty of other sites which have very rich and strong journalistic roots. So like Lichfield Blog, which is producing about 10 pieces of news every day. Saddleworth News, which I'll talk about in a moment, is written by a journalist who's currently a stay-at-home dad. And then you've got people like Andrew Gilligan, who you will all know, who writes for an online Greenwich website that Clayton pointed me in the direction of a couple of months ago. So I think there are a lot of overlaps between what these sites are doing and what traditional journalism is doing. I've listed kind of some of them there. Here's a classic example of holding public bodies to account. This came out about 2 weeks ago from Saddleworth News, where Richard sent an FOI to the council to say, how much is this website, Oldham says, costing? And how many people are using it? And then he was able to splash with the story, which then got picked up more widely by the printed press, that a site that cost £25,000 was getting just 2,500 visitors. You know, and you can see you might expect quiet traffic in August, but 296 people in September, is that a sensible use of public money? They're doing a lot of council reporting. So SE1 saying, you know, they're retweeting the council's tweets. Now that might in itself seem very simple, but as James says, they've got 4,000 followers on Twitter, whereas his local council, either Lambeth or Southwark, I'm not sure which one, they've got only 800. So it's raising the visibility of council issues to an audience who might not otherwise see it. The Ventnor blog on the Isle of Wight, which is a fantastic full-time site, doing things like a bit like when you're getting kind of live commentary from cricket or football on like the Guardian or the BBC site. They're actually sitting there in the chamber and writing an account of what's going on as it happens. And similarly in Stoke, you've got sites like Pits and Pots reporting on what's happening with the council and its budget. And then I just included a few other news examples. I mean, Hearts Web TV, that's run by a guy who works full-time for the NHS. He runs 2 hyperlocal websites, and he's just set up a video site. And he decided during the general election to record the hustings and to get interviews with all of the different candidates. And he reckoned that in his area, that just wouldn't happen otherwise. People wouldn't be able to access hustings or wouldn't know what happened at them. So he bought a vision mixer from eBay, he had 2 cameras, and he just went ahead and did it. And that's very much the kind of news and stuff that we're starting to see happening. So we're nearly there before we all start coughing and spluttering. Top 5 challenges for this sector. Well, the big issue is discoverability. And there are an awful lot of sites that are out there, but not a lot of people know where they are or that they exist. And that's a big challenge. There is a directory on a site called Openly Local, which has about 340 sites on it. But if you don't know Openly Local exists, you can't put your site on it. So when I talked to Craig, who runs Hearts Web TV, he didn't know anything about it. And he runs 3 sites. And I'd only found those through the comments on an article he'd posted somewhere else. There are big issues around funding and making it pay, not just around getting advertising for stuff that's so niche, but a real concern for a lot of these people is getting credit for where they've produced content. So quite often they'll find newspapers lifting their material, quite often word for word, and not accrediting it or sourcing it. And this is a sector that's not recognised by the NUJ or by anybody else, so they haven't got a means to kind of knock on their door and say, actually, you need to pay us for the material that you're taking. And pretty much without fail, every hyperlocal blogger you talk to will have a story or 2 of where that's happened. And that also is the same with pictures as well, where they've been on the scene, they've taken pictures, and it's just been lifted by traditional print press in particular. There are big issues about resources. Most of these things are one-man bands. This is particularly an issue in the event of people deciding they haven't got time to do it, their circumstances change, and so sites just fold or they don't get updated very often. Or if they get challenged legally, again, most bloggers have had irate telephone calls at 10 o'clock at night from their local council threatening to sue them, threatening to them that they'll lose their house and so forth. And actually, you know, if you work for the NHS and you do this in your spare time, that's quite a scary prospect. And who on earth do you talk to get support and to understand whether you've got a leg to stand on or not? So that leads into the issue around sort of isolation, the fact that very few people who work in this space know other people who work in this space, and yet actually they've often got the same issues. And one of the things we've tried to do over the last year is support opportunities for this community to come together. And Christina and I were at a session that was in this very room only last month, where we had 80 people from London who all came together, and they all had much the same issues, but they'd never met each other before. And I think that's a fantastic, very easy thing for us to try and facilitate and to do, and that we get credit for. And then lastly, there is an issue around quality and a perception of quality from audiences. A lot of people think because this is semi-amateur or amateur, it's not going to be very good. Well, actually, yes, there are some sites that aren't very good, but there's an awful lot that are fantastic, and they're just as high quality as anything that's been offered by a commercial organisation. And what the stats show is that when people find sites, they tend to come back and use them on a fairly regular basis. So in terms of opportunities for the sector, we're starting to see more tie-ups and partnerships between hyperlocal and traditional media. BBC are getting involved in Birmingham. Channel 4 have funded an initiative called Talk About Local to train 3,000 community activists to use the web to do what they do better. And clearly there are other things around, the cost of producing this stuff is just getting cheaper and cheaper and easier and easier. What might happen next? This is the last 5 slides. Well, certainly if you talk to the people who do this commercially, if you talk to Sean Kelly and James Hatts, they're very concerned that there might be a large commercial organisation might just suddenly come in and say, actually, there's a massive market here that we can tap into. And the most obvious example of an organisation that might well do that is Patch, who are based in the States, and last year AOL put 50 million into them to do hyperlocal in the States. Now, it started very small. As I was saying, in April, so only 6 months ago, 46 sites, but they're looking to expand that to 500 by the end of the year, which is a phenomenal increase. And they're also recruiting and bringing in a whole load of new people to work on their sites at a time when traditional journalistic outlets are cutting back and jobs are being lost. So they call themselves the biggest new hire of full-time journalists in the US. It's actually a slight lie. Most people do it part-time. But the point remains that they're recruiting 500 people when most other newspaper groups or media outlets are slashing jobs. Location-based services, well, this is again is a fairly new thing and probably worth an Inside Ofcom in itself. People either think this is going to be the next big thing or it's a complete red herring. I'm more towards this will be the next big thing phase, but this is around when people are using their smartphones or other resources that can tap in where people are based and where you will get content and different messages pushed at you. So Foursquare and Facebook Places are perhaps the best known examples of that, but in the States there's a whole load of other services. Now, this stuff is incredibly small fry. This is from The Independent and shows you the size of the kind of internet universe as accessed by mobile phones, and all of the location-based stuff is down here. It's tiny compared to the likes of Skype and Facebook, etc. But then it's equally pretty new. So as awareness increases, as more services come online, as more people get smartphones, you can predict that actually more people will probably go on board and do this. One of the barriers they have to overcome, apart from awareness and so forth, is the issue of privacy. There's this fantastic website called pleaserobme.com, which pulls in data from where people are saying, I'm at such and such a pub, or I'm going off on holiday to such and such a place, and saying, well, actually, it doesn't take that much intuition to work out who you are and where you live, and actually you're not at home. And that website pulls in all of these different feeds, and really as an education point for people to say, be careful about the data that you are sharing in the public domain. So just to give a quick example of just how new this is. So Foursquare, I think, is probably the best known of this, but it only launched in March last year, and it's got about 3 million users around the world already, which is pretty quick from a standing start 18 months ago, or less than 18 months ago. They're extremely good self-publicists, as this slide shows. Not many people are going to be unlocking the Foursquare space badge, I suspect. Facebook Places also launched recently. I mean, I've included some examples here of kind of the danger of saying where you are from my own Facebook, where this was an email where my wife sent me a thing saying, we're at the cinema. Well, that's great, but that means there's no one at home. Or we've gone to see a gig in North London and so forth. So this is the kind of stuff that you can share on Facebook Places. And they only had the idea 9 months ago before they launched it. So they're turning stuff around incredibly quickly to make this kind of hyperlocal land grab. In terms of content, again, this is an example from the States, but where the States starts, we will probably inevitably follow. Starbucks have opened its Wi-Fi to everybody, and they've got their own kind of walled garden of content that you can access within their stores, which includes hyperlocal content. Bit more in terms of reverse publishing, by which I mean material that starts online but then ends up in a print form. So a local example of that would be in Beverley, in the East Riding, really, really lovely mini York of a town, where they've got a website and they're producing the best of their web content in a weekly print run. Only 100 copies, but I think still an interesting trend. And again, in the States, we see big versions of that. In Chicago, for example, the Tribune produces the best of its online stuff as weekly supplements for 5 different districts in Chicago. And then lastly, I think the other trend we'll see is everything becoming social. I think there's a really interesting statistic that I found earlier on, that 75% of news we consume online is stuff that is shared with us. So the kind of traditional model of broadcasters and newspapers and so forth sending news to you is kind of dying out. Instead, what we tend to do is access stuff that our friends have recommended or sent to us, either by email or on Facebook and so forth. And the reasons for that, well, are partly around kind of trust. We trust our friends perhaps more than we trust traditional media. This was from a survey done a couple of years ago that Stephen Barnett wrote about in British Journalism Review. And I kind of, love this, that journalists fared worse than any other group in terms of the fall in trust in the last 5 years, with the exception of red top reporters whose reputation was so low it couldn't sink any further. And of course, we want different things from our media as well. We don't just want to choose and be selective about what we access. When we do access it, we also want to talk about it with people who are like us, both our friends and other people in our area, or people who've got similar interests. So I'll leave you with some thoughts from a guy called Rick Waghorn, who is a blogger in Norfolk, who says, big is bust and big is broken, small is the new big. And for him and quite a lot of other people, what the web will do is just result in us consuming hyperlocal media at the expense of everything else. Okay, more than enough from me. Over to you, if you've got any questions. Don't all speak at once. Clayton.
Thanks for that, Damien. That was really interesting. One quick question for you. There's obviously been an explosion of hyperlocal sites. Has that sucked readers and advertisers, or mainly readers, from traditional media, or has this actually increased people's media consumption across the piece?
I think it's the latter. If you think of the slide that was right at the beginning, which showed what people were doing, actually most people were consuming more media rather than less. And they're consuming it at different times. So the beauty of a lot of these sites, particularly the online ones, is people can obviously access it whenever they want and pretty much from wherever they want, rather than waiting for traditional broadcast bulletin at 6:30 or the weekly newspaper coming out and so forth. And certainly there's data from the States which says people are consuming more news and not less. Christina. Oh, no, I'll come to you next.
First, shall I?
There we go. Very, very interesting presentation. I have a question around business models, actually, because it's something I'm really interested in. And I think there is a tension, isn't there, between the kind of community side of these things, which I think is very attractive to a lot of people who are part of it, because, you are part of a community and it's your local people who are writing it. So it's a very different ethic to kind of commercial media. And so, it was really interesting to listen to the examples that you were talking about people trying to take transactions and so on. And I think for me, it kind of points towards a more community-funded model as opposed to advertising or kind of other ways, or even, subscription and so on. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
I think that's right. I think there are a few people who are doing this because they want to make money out of it, and they're not being very successful. Most people are not getting into this space to make money. It's because they're passionate about their community and wanting to put something back. But clearly, some remuneration for that would be extremely welcome. In terms of community funding models, I think the best example to share is one from San Francisco around a website called Spot Us, which is an investigative journalism website where members of the community can say things that they would like to be investigated, and then the community votes on it and hands over money for an investigative journalist to go away and do it. Now that's an incredibly different and new model of doing things, and that is the community saying, actually, we have decided this is the issue that needs investigating the most, and we're going to make a contribution towards it.
That's a really interesting example. I think, my own experience, I guess, comes more from people like Urban 75, who I probably know best. And it's really been fascinating to see, because they started off as, just a small Brixton-based site, and now, it's New York and so on. But actually, people came to them and said, look, we really like what you're doing. Can you do this, in our area as well? But as you said, they're completely, they don't have advertising, and it's run by volunteers. But then it generates revenue in other ways. So, for example, because of publicity, Mike is able to go out and, get some other, photography work or other kinds of work. So I think quite a few people do this as in, this is my voluntary stuff. It helps me raise profile, meet people, and then I get work in other ways. But it's a very, very different funding model.
It is. It is.
Yes, thank you. Interesting presentation. One of my hobbies is website design, and you mentioned on one of your slides there discoverability and the problems with how a website is discovered by anyone. Perhaps I'm being naive, but the way I would have done it would simply be to insert the relevant meta tags into the system and then make sure that Google, which is a very popular search engine, spiders your site so that you get a good ranking on it. Or am I being...
No, it really is as simple as that. But for most of these people, they don't. A lot of these people don't know that, or don't know how to do that. So they don't understand about metadata. They don't understand about search engine optimization techniques. They don't understand about using Google Analytics as a way of understanding what their audience wants and doesn't want. I mean, an awful lot of these people are not as technically savvy or as web savvy as perhaps we are. And therefore, you do get some people who do this, and it's very easy to put in an area into Google and you'll find some sites. But equally, there's an awful lot that just don't. But one of the challenges is, again, that there is no kind of organisation or body which can provide that training for them, or kind of a single source that says, actually, if you're doing this, here's what you do. Here's your 5 steps of things to do to make sure people know you're about. And that's a real challenge for that sector.
Hi. Doesn't that last point actually highlight probably one of the fundamental issues with this is the technical? I know you mentioned about WordPress, setting up a blog on WordPress, but it's the prerequisite of having at least a spattering of knowledge around the web. Also, given that more commercial entities such as News International are throwing up paywalls, what does this do to the whole landscape? Do we have at one end just amateurs and at the other end sites behind paywalls in the future?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that easily. I mean, if I come back to the kind of the WordPress and the issue around sort of technical architecture, I think that's where the work that Talk About Local are doing is quite interesting. So Talk About Local is an initiative supported by Channel 4 through 4IP. It's run by Will Perrin, who I mentioned earlier. And what they're doing is, over 2 years, training existing community activists to use the web to do the stuff that they would have traditionally done by kind of handbills and stuff that they would have produced in their living room. And trying to show them that through embracing social media and web tools, they can engage with a whole new audience and often do that in a more kind of cost-efficient way. But a lot of these people they've no idea what Twitter is, and why would they? A lot of them haven't necessarily been online. They are traditional kind of community activists who do things in a particular way. So this is very new to them, and they're really the only people I know of who are working at that kind of level to train people and give them those skills. But they're working with people who are already interested in doing this and who've been doing this for quite a long time. For people who aren't, who are new to this, it's much harder. In terms of the issue around paywalls, or you've also seen some of like Johnson had paywalls for some of their local newspaper sites, and they ditched them because they were unsuccessful. So my guess would be you may well see more paywalls at a kind of national level, but the local stuff will just remain open and as it is. I don't think any of the kind of people I know in this space are interested in producing their own kind of paywalls. It kind of goes against their ethic of being open and accessible. And whilst they might make more money doing that, or some money doing that, they would rather be consumed by the largest possible audience, making no money, than being read by 5 people and making £50 a month. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Anyone else? No? Okay. Well, we'll draw to a close there. In terms of the future stuff that's coming up, just a couple of dates for your diaries. No more talking from me, you'll be pleased to hear. But next month, we've got a session looking at community media in SE1, so stuff that's happening on our doorstep. We've got James Hatts coming in from the SE1 website. We've got Ed Baxter coming in from Resonance FM, who are the community radio station for the area, and Chris Hayden talking about his work with Southwark TV. And then in the new year, following the publication of some research that's coming out at the end of this month, Kevin Harris and Hugh Flouch are going to talk about how public bodies, from sort of local authorities through to national government and so forth, can make use of hyperlocal sites and are making use of hyperlocal sites as a way for them to engage with citizens who are currently disenfranchised from the political process. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.